It began quietly, the way most betrayals do, not with a loud confrontation, but with whispers in the dark corners of rooms I didn't even know existed. At first, I didn't realize it was happening. I thought the missed opportunities, the cold stares, and the sudden shift in how people treated me were just bad luck. But bad luck doesn't send anonymous emails to your boss. Bad luck doesn't spread rumors with surgical precision. Bad luck doesn't have a face. This did. And I knew exactly whose face it was. We used to be friends, close ones in fact. The kind of friendship where you share secrets you'd never tell anyone else. I trusted them with things I'd never even written down. And maybe that's where I made my first mistake. Because trust, I've learned, is like a loaded gun. You can hand it over, but you have no control over where it's aimed. They started small. Tiny lies about me missing deadlines. Whispers that I was bad-mouthing people I'd never even spoken ill of. It escalated to forged documents, fake evidence meant to paint me as dishonest. My career began to wobble. My social circle shrank. People I'd known for years suddenly acted like I was toxic. It was almost admirable, in a twisted way, how methodical they were. They didn't just want to hurt me, they wanted to erase me. For weeks, I felt like I was drowning in a tide I couldn't swim against. Every time I tried to defend myself, it seemed to confirm their lies. That's when I realized I couldn't fight this directly. If I confronted them head-on, I'd lose. They had the momentum, the narrative, and everyone's ear. So, I did the opposite of what they expected. I stayed quiet. I pretended to crumble. I let them think they'd won. While they were celebrating in the shadows, I was working in them. I started collecting every piece of proof I could find. Timestamps, emails, screenshots, security footage, witness statements. I became meticulous, almost obsessive. I learned where they slipped up, where their lies didn't line up. And, interestingly enough, I discovered that the same arrogance that made them believe they could destroy me would be their undoing. I knew I couldn't just reveal the truth all at once. No, that would be too easy for them to deny. Instead, I began planting seeds, small corrections to the story that made people doubt their version. An offhand comment here, a coincidental piece of proof there. I reconnected with people who had drifted away, not to explain everything, but to subtly remind them who I really was. Slowly, the cracks began to show. Then came the day I was waiting for. They made their biggest mistake, a public accusation that was not only false but easily disproven with the mountain of evidence I'd been quietly building. I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to beg for people to listen. I simply presented the facts, calmly, methodically, and with enough undeniable proof to crush every lie they'd told. The fallout was immediate. People they thought would always side with them suddenly turned cold. Their credibility evaporated overnight. And the best part? I didn't even have to destroy them myself. They'd set their own trap. I just let them walk into it. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, but the truth is, it was bittersweet. I'd lost time, relationships, and a part of myself in the process. But I'd also gained something far more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that I could survive being broken and put myself back together sharper than before. If you want, I can also make a slightly more intense and psychological version of this story, so it feels like a high-stakes thriller instead. Alright, here's an extended, more detailed continuation of the story so it becomes richer, more tense, and more emotionally layered. I'll keep the same voice and narrative style, but push it further into a slow-burn psychological drama. After the truth came out, you'd think it would be over. In movies, this is where the villain slinks away in shame and the hero walks off into the sunset. But real life doesn't work like that. When you corner someone who's built their entire identity on lies, they don't just stop, they panic. And panic makes people dangerous. For a while, they stayed quiet. Too quiet. I knew it wasn't surrender, it was plotting. Sure enough, little things began to happen again. My phone would ring with unknown numbers. People I barely knew would message me with oddly personal questions, as if fishing for information. Then came the coincidences, running into them at places they had no reason to be, overhearing fragments of conversation that sounded suspiciously like my life being dissected. But here's the thing, by then I'd changed. I was no longer the person who had been blindsided before. I'd learned to read between the lines, to spot the faint scent of manipulation before it even had a chance to spread. And most importantly, I had learned patience, the kind that unnerves your enemy because they can't figure out what you're waiting for. I started building a second file. Not just evidence of what they were doing now, but a psychological map of how they operated. Patterns, triggers, weak points. I studied them like a puzzle, like a predator studies prey. Every time they thought they'd found a new way to rattle me, I made note of it, quietly feeding the fire I knew would eventually consume them. Then came the opportunity one had been waiting for. They had inserted themselves into a new circle of people, a group who didn't know their history. Naturally, they had started painting me as the villain there too. This time, I didn't even need to defend myself. I just slipped small truths into the right ears, truths that seemed harmless at first, but began to snowball into doubts, then suspicion. Within weeks, the same group they had tried to turn against me began to keep their distance from them. I didn't stop there. I made sure the right people, people with real influence, saw both the past and present patterns laid out in stark clarity. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't yell, I didn't humiliate them in public. I just let the truth bleed into every space they tried to occupy until there was nowhere left for them to stand, without feeling the walls closing in. The final nail came unexpectedly. They overplayed their hand, trying to sabotage someone else the way they had tried with me. But this new target wasn't as forgiving or as patient. That person confronted them publicly, and everything I had been quietly documenting became the backdrop for their downfall. It wasn't my hand that pushed them over the edge. It was the weight of their own actions, compounded over time, crushing them completely. And just like that, they were gone. Not in a dramatic, cinematic exit, just faded out of relevance, their name now a cautionary whisper. I didn't need to keep looking over my shoulder anymore. People ask me if I regret not taking the high road, and I always laugh a little at that. The high road is admirable, sure, but sometimes the high road is just a path you take while someone's digging a grave for you. I chose a different road, one that required cunning, patience, and the ability to look an enemy in the eye and smile as if nothing was wrong. Because the best way to outsmart someone who tries to destroy your life is to let them think they've already succeeded, and then dismantle their world piece by piece until there's nothing left for them to stand on. Got it? I'll expand it even more, adding deeper tension, psychological warfare, and moments that feel like you're inside the narrator's head. Got it? I'll expand it even more, adding deeper tension, psychological warfare, and moments that feel like you're inside the narrator's head, watching every move unfold. The thing about survival is that once you've been targeted, you never really go back to being the same person. You learn to see shadows where others see light. You learn that every smile might hide a knife, and every handshake might be a setup. And I had learned all of that the hard way. In the months after their first big public collapse, I thought they might retreat for good. Maybe disappear. But people like them don't vanish, they reinvent. They came back under a new image, a new angle, surrounding themselves with fresh allies who didn't know the history. And there it was again, that low, familiar hum of danger. The way they'd glance at me if we crossed paths, like they were daring me to react. I didn't. Not because I wasn't angry. But because I knew now that silence was my most dangerous weapon. The next phase of my plan wasn't about defending myself. It was about removing their ability to harm anyone again. That meant watching, learning, and waiting for the moment when their own ambition would become the trap. And it came sooner than I thought. They were trying to position themselves in a place of influence. A charity board of all things, a perfect stage for them to look benevolent while quietly pulling strings behind the scenes. But the higher you climb, the more eyes are on you. And I had already ensured that some of those eyes belonged to people who trusted me. It started small, a few inconsistencies in their public statements, minor contradictions in their stories. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I made sure the right people did. I didn't accuse, I didn't even hint. I simply gave others the tools to see the truth themselves. That's the beauty of subtlety. It feels like discovery, not persuasion. Meanwhile, I began feeding back pieces of their own tactics into their world. Anonymous tips, but not lies. Truths they'd hope no one would remember. Old messages resurfaced. Old victims found the courage to speak. And while they scrambled to plug the holes, I was already drilling new ones. The tension built slowly, like a rope tightening around their neck. I watched them become more erratic, snapping at allies, making sloppy mistakes. It was almost too easy to guide them into situations where they would reveal themselves. All I had to do was leave the right temptation in their path, the right opportunity to lash out, and they would take it. Every single
time.
The final blow wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. A single meeting, attended by people whose opinion mattered, where every piece of evidence, every pattern, every past and present action was laid out in calm, irrefutable detail. No accusations, just truth. And truth, when presented without the heat of emotion, can be the sharpest blade. They didn't shout. They didn't even deny it. They just sat there, pale and silent, as their carefully constructed life crumbled in front of them. When it was over, they didn't look at me. They couldn't. In the days that followed, they vanished from every circle that mattered. Opportunities dried up. Friends drifted away. Their name became a ghost, whispered in warning, never in praise. I didn't celebrate. There was no victory dance, no glass of champagne. Just a quiet evening at home, the knowledge settling in that I'd taken back not just my reputation, but my power. They had tried to destroy me. And in the end, I had destroyed the very foundation they stood on, without ever laying a hand on them. The truth is, I didn't win because I was stronger. I won because I learned. I learned their patterns, their weaknesses, and most importantly, I learned patience. Because sometimes the smartest move you can make is to let your enemy believe they're ahead, until they look down and realize the ground beneath them is gone.